Code First Migration uses a new database initializer called Migrate Database to Latest Version, bringing to 4 the number of initialization strategies that are available in Code First. Now you can use something like drop create database if model changes for the early stages of application and database development, and then switch to Migrate Database to Latest Version later when the designs begin to stabilize and you want to preserve database objects and data whenever the model changes. This is a huge leap forward in the usefulness of Entity Framework Code First. Now there are 2 kinds of migration strategies. One is automatic migration, and the other is code-based migration. Automatic migration is the simpler of the 2 strategies. Like Code First itself, you don't have to maintain database migration manually in the code file for each change that you make in your domain classes. You just need to run a command in Package Manager console to enable it, and Code First Migrations does the rest. It really does start bordering on magic. Code-based migration is useful when you want explicit control on migration, to do things like set the default value of a column and other actions to fine-tune the database schema. As you probably expect, code-based migration gives you far more control over the process at the cost of having to write a fair bit of code, depending on just how extensively you want to keep control over things. So now I'm going to show you how you can implement automatic migrations, but keep in mind that you have a lot more options with code-based migrations. I'm going to change the ordering sample application yet again. But this time I'm going to enable automatic migrations. Then I'll add some data to the database and make a change to the code model, adding a new property. Then I'll run the application again and see that the database retains the existing data after updating the schema. And I'll change the schema actually in a couple different ways. Alright, now there are some things that I need to do to make migrations available to the application. But the nice thing here is that when you install Entity Framework, it installs some PowerShell scripts that are added to the NuGet Package Manager console. And that includes migrations. Okay, so I'm going to come here to the Package Manager console. Now, if it's not open, I can come up here to Tools and select NuGet Package Manager and select the Package Manager console. Now, I'm using this version of the console, but remember that if you want to make changes to multiple projects in a solution all at once, you can use this form of the console. I only have one project in my solution, so I'm going to stick with the Package Manager console. Alright, so previously I had used the console to install Entity Framework, but now what I'm going to do is, first of all, make sure that the default project is ordering. Okay, as you can see, it's the only project in the solution. But if you have multiple projects, particularly if you have a single solution that includes multiple data layers, you're probably not going to want to apply some of these changes to all of the projects, or more specifically, you don't want to apply it to the wrong project. So make sure that you have the default project set to the correct one. Okay, but again, not a problem here because I only have one project in the solution. Alright, then enabling migrations is pretty easy. So I'm going to enable migrations, so that's the command, and I'll hit enter. And there are some options that you can use when you need different features. Alright, so now it's looking at the current state of Code First, checking whether there's a database and so forth, doing everything that it needs to do in order to enable migrations. Now I have to admit, the first time that I ran this command and got this highlighted yellow bright message, which is highly unusual for a console window in Visual Studio. It certainly happens, but it looks like, oh my gosh, I did something wrong. And the wording even kind of implies something's wrong. So it said, detected database created with a database initializer. Scaffold migration, timestamp underscore initial create, and I'll talk about what that is in just a moment, corresponding to the existing database. To use an automatic migration instead, delete the migrations folder and rerun enable migrations, specifying the enable automatic migrations parameter. So that kind of sounds like, oh, I just screwed up. I did something wrong. It created part of it, but it couldn't do all of it. Well, no. Everything is cool and great. It made all the changes to the application that I'm going to be talking about in just a moment, made all the changes to the project that it needs for migrations to work. But the last part of this message just means that it didn't turn on automatic migrations. Now, I could have run this command with the enable automatic migrations parameter, but I didn't want to do that because I want to show you how to turn it on manually as well. Okay? So you could use that parameter, and there's various other things that you can do, and there's various other commands that you can use with migrations. Okay, so everything's great, and it successfully scaffolded the initial migration, which is essentially a snapshot into the state of the application, but again has not enabled the automatic migrations. Okay, one of the most obvious changes is if I come over here to Solution Explorer, I now have this migrations folder that I didn't have before. Okay, so at this point migrations is enabled. But as you can see, I have a couple files in this migrations folder. Let's take a look at configuration first. Okay, so notice that it's within the namespace ordering migrations. So that follows a standard within MVC that for some of the standard folders that Visual Studio knows about, not necessarily for your custom folders, it will put them in a namespace that is the project name dot the name of the folder. Okay. Now to use migrations, you have to have a configuration file. Name doesn't matter, but what's important is that it inherits from the DB migrations configuration object. And as part of that, you need to specify the ordering context object. Now it saw that I had this context object implemented within the project, and so it picked that up and created this migration for that ordering context. Okay, now you need this class, this DB migrations configuration class, in addition to the ordering context, because the ordering context still has the code first model information that it's going to be using. Okay, so here's where, because I didn't include that additional parameter, it set automatic migrations enabled, set that property to false in this constructor for the class. And then it also set a context key. That's not relevant to what I'm talking about here. But essentially what it's doing is it's tying it together with the context object. All right, then there's also a stub method here for seed, because here, like what I did in another part of the application, you can seed the database with data. And it has some sample code, shows you how to implement that feature. Okay, so you need this class. The most important thing is this automatic migrations enable. All right, so let's take a look at that other file that was created here, this timestamp along with initial create.cs. So I'll take a look at that. Okay, and keep in mind, by the way, that the timestamp portion of that file is going to be different when you try this, because you're going to be creating these objects at different times than I have. Okay, but it will have a suffix of underscore initial create. So this is the first migration based on the existing database. It created this because I originally created that database with a database initializer. If I was using code first with an existing database that I didn't create using code first, using one of those other database initializers, then I would not have gotten this code, because it would look at that as essentially a pre-state. So it doesn't need to ever recreate that database. Okay, so the purpose of this migration in this file is to get us to the point in time when we enabled migrations, in case we need to recreate the database. So this is code that provides a representation of how to get to the current state of the database, along with the ability to move forward and backward from this state. So it has two methods. One is up, and these are overridden versions of the methods implemented by DB migration. So this up method allows you to move forward to this point. And you can see in the code here how it creates four tables: dbo.addresses, customers, orders, and customer addresses. So it creates those 4 tables and also creates the fields within those tables. All right, and it uses a create table method that is implemented by this DB migration object. All right, and so as I mentioned, it also includes the column definitions, primary and foreign key definitions, and indexes. In a more complex database schema, there would even be more code. But one very important thing to notice here is that there's no code here at all that puts data in the database, and I'll talk about down in just a moment. So this is just recreating the schema. If I wanted to recreate the data, I would need to do that in the seed method, and I showed you that stub just a moment ago. But I could also do things like creating an integration services package within SQL Server to load a new database with data as well. So there's lots of options for doing that kind of thing. But all of this code within this migration is how Code First Migrations describes creating those objects. Then, in future migrations, as you continue to make changes to the model, you'll probably have calls to various other methods of the DB migration object, which you can view by right-clicking on that object and going to the definition. And there you can see all of the methods that are available on that object. So for example, we have a couple of overloaded create table methods. So one of those is the one that's currently being used in the initial create file in order to create those different tables. But as you can see, there's various add, alter, drop, and so forth. Various methods that you can use in your code in order to modify the table. Okay, so let's go back over here and look at this down method. So this is also overriding a method of that base object. Again, that DB migration object right there. And this code takes the database in the other direction from up. If we needed to migrate the project to an earlier migration state, then Code First Migrations will call this method instead of the up method. In this case, since it's the initial create migration, the down method deletes the objects in the database. But notably, it doesn't delete the database itself. So it drops foreign keys, it drops the indexes, drops the tables, doesn't drop the database. Okay, so up moves forward in time, down moves backwards in time. So you can get a sense that when you have a number of migrations in the project over time, you can fairly easily move to an earlier migration state or move forward from an earlier migration with them all chained together. And now you can see why there's a timestamp as part of the file name. Okay, so that's the infrastructure that was created. Now it's time to enable automatic migrations. So all I need to do at this point to do that is to change that to true. Okay, and I'll save the change. And so now automatic migrations is enabled for this project. So this is what tells Entity Framework to take over migrations for you so you don't have to worry about all the details. It really does become automatic. Now there is one more thing that we need to do. The application is currently set to use the drop create database of model changes initialization strategy through a custom ordering initializer class in the ordering model code file here. Okay, so this is the file, of course, where I have all of my classes that implement my code first model. Okay, so if I scroll down here, there's that ordering initializer. And I had previously been using it in order to see the database with data. So instead what I need to do is I need to tell the application to use the database initializer that works with migrations. So in order to do that, I need to go over here to Solution Explorer, open up my global.asax file, because this is where I specified that I wanted to use that ordering initializer code. So I'm going to comment out that and create a new statement here. It's going to be the same form, database.setInitializer. But now I'm going to new up a migrate database to latest version object, and I'm going to pass in the ordering.models.ordering context, .ordering context. Okay. And need to use the right syntax. There. So I'm going to new up that object. And then I also need to specify the name of the configuration file, actually the configuration class that I'm going to use. And that's the one that is defined here within this configuration file that was created when I enabled migrations. Okay, so I need to specify ordering.migrations, remember it's in that folder and in that namespace, .configuration. Okay, so another form of that set initializer. Hopefully I did all that right and everything will go away. Okay, something's not right. Oh, get so excited about this I used the wrong syntax. Okay, so there we go. Okay, because set initializer is a method and it's in the newing up that I need to specify these objects. Okay. Now, one thing about the use of the configuration class right there. Using it this way that I'm doing in this code here works because all of the layers of the application are in a single project. But if I come back over here and look at the configuration class again, notice that this is defined as an internal sealed class. Sealed means that you can't inherit from the class, which is not normally a problem. But internal means that it isn't visible or usable from outside the project. If your application has a data layer separate from the other tiers, this can be a problem. In that case, you can feel free to change the definition to a public class, leaving or removing the sealed keyword as you want. Okay, so just a little word of warning there. I'm not absolutely sure why Microsoft did it that way because it's so common to separate the tiers of an application into different layers. All right, another note is that I'm setting this initialization here within the application start event method, but you can also set the database initializer in the application.config file. In that case, you wouldn't need to change the definition of the configuration class as I just talked about. Okay, but the definition in the config file is a little bit convoluted. You can find the syntax online, but it's just kind of convoluted to put in. So I find using code just much easier, unless I need some special feature of the configuration that way. Okay, so that's everything I need to do in order to enable migrations. And part of the work was because I had already done some things within the application. I needed to undo a few things in order to make this work. In a new application, if I was going to enable migrations right up front, then it's a little bit simpler than the steps I showed you. All right, so now what I want to do is I want to change the model so that migrations kick in. If I just ran the model right, or ran the application right now, migrations wouldn't kick in because I haven't changed the model since the last time I ran the application. So I'm going to come back over again to my ordering model and scroll back up to my customer class. And I'm going to add a rating property. So this is going to be a public integer called rating, and I'll add my getter and setter. Okay, so just scenario here is that we have some way of rating our customers, whatever that might mean. Now, one other thing that isn't absolutely necessary, but I just wanted to do in order to make a point, is that I'm going to come down here and go ahead and comment out this ordering initializer class. I want you to be confident that that code is not executing to create any kind of data within the database. Okay? Now, I'm not using this class anywhere anymore, so the code's not going to run, but just in case you have any lingering doubts about that. All right, so once again, save the code. I'll run the application, And I'll hope that I did everything correctly. Okay, I did. Always good news. And so I get this index view. And notice that I have 2 customers. I changed the model, but it didn't drop and recreate the database in response. Instead, migrations updated the database. And now you see why I wanted to comment out that ordering initializer code. I wanted you to be absolutely confident that that code was not running. So I didn't secretly drop and recreate the database behind the scenes, and this data is still there because that seed method ran. It didn't run, it couldn't run because it's commented out. So this is the data that already existed in the database. All right, I'll end execution, and I'll come over here to Management Studio. Come down into Databases. We're still using the Ordering System database here. And go down to Tables, go down into Customers, Columns, and you'll see that the schema, in fact, was changed. The rating property is now there. Best of all, if I right-click here, something you already know, if I look at the return the 1,000 rows, you can see that those records are there. Okay? Because the database was updated, not dropped and recreated. Okay. So that's how migrations work. There's a few more things to talk about in this. Because I enabled automatic migrations, the project is no longer keeping track of subsequent migrations after the initial create. And you can see that because I'll come back over here, look at Solution Explorer, look at my migrations folder, select it and even refresh, and notice that there are no new migrations. Okay? Because automatic migrations is keeping track of all this for me. If I wanted to take control, turn off automatic migrations, and use code-based migrations, then it'd be a different story. Okay, so just an observation about that. Now, what happens if I were to remove a property? Well, let's find out. So I'm going to go back up to customers here in my ordering model, not too far, and I'm going to comment out that new property that I just added and save my changes. I'll run the application again, and migrations will kick in because it sees that I made a change to the model. And I get an error message. Well, I always kind of have mixed feelings about this, but in general, this is one of the good error messages. Because what it says here is that automatic data loss exception was unhandled by user code, so this is obviously an exception that's implemented by migrations, and it gives you the type and everything. But the additional information says that automatic migration was not applied because it would result in data loss. If I want to override that, what I need to do is set automatic migration data loss allowed, set that property to true. All right, so essentially what this means is that migrations didn't make this latest model change because it could have caused a data loss. Now, we don't yet have any data in the rating column. I had just created the column. It's nullable. Didn't add any data. There's nothing there. But Entity Framework is playing it safe, and it's refusing to perform the operation, which is a very conservative choice that errs on the side of preserving data. Preserving data is a good thing. Okay, and this is the default protection that's built into migrations. Now, it's very important to understand that this is not because it's going to remove any rows of data, but because it would remove one or more columns in this particular case. The rows will be intact, as I showed you earlier. All right, now, it's always nice when a Microsoft error message has a correct solution to the problem, if you really consider this a problem. Because you very well could say, oh my gosh, I didn't mean to delete that. I commented out the wrong line. Okay, so the message has a solution, but it doesn't mention the option of undoing the change that caused this message. Okay, so if one of the solutions to this is I could go back to the ordering model and uncomment that rating property, in which case I'd run the application again. Code first sees that the model hadn't changed, and the application runs normally. Okay, so that is an option. But the option that I'm going to do here is I'm going to stop execution, and I'm going to use that automatic migration data loss allowed. So I'm going to come over to the configuration class right there, and I'm going to set the automatic migration data loss allowed, set that to true, and save my change. This tells migrations that I explicitly want to allow changes that could cause data loss. And as far as migrations is concerned, I'm the one to blame if anything goes wrong. So at this point now, I can't scream about lost data when I make a change to the model, and I've explicitly allowed this. Okay? So this is another example of a property of that configuration class, specifically of the DB migrations configurations object, that I would probably turn on in earlier stages of application development. Once I migrate this project or move the database to, say, a development or a test server, or certainly to a production server, I'm going to want to change that back to false. Because if I'm working on an application, I'm going directly against, well, I won't even mention going directly against a production database. You would hopefully never do that. But even against a development or a test server, you would turn that off so that you don't accidentally make changes. Hopefully by then, the application and the database schema are stable enough that you're not making wholesale changes to it anymore. Okay, so I've made that change. I'm going to execute the application again. And this time it should run successfully. It is having to make that change to commenting out the ratings column. And I get the application. If I come back over here to Management Studio, notice amongst other things that I actually have objects open in Windows in Management Studio. Because it's updating the database, it's not doing a wholesale drop, that's okay. So it makes it a little bit easier to work with the application. So if I refresh this in Object Explorer, look at columns again, you can see that the rating property is now gone. The rating field is now gone. And if I refresh this query right here, execute it, actually get an error because rating is in it. So I'll now execute that. I get the data, and it's still intact. All right, I'm going to push this even a little bit harder. Come back over to my application here, my ordering model. I'm going to add an entirely new class to the model, which is going to result in at least one new table. So I'm going to come down here after the order table, but before order context, just so all of my classes are together. Oops, need to stop execution. Obviously, I often forget to do that. And I'm going to add a shipper class. So this is going to be a new part of my object model. Call it shipper. And add a few properties. I'm going to do a public int. I'm going to use convention to do a shipper ID that code first will identify as primary key for the table. I'll add another public property, string, call it shipper name. And a public decimal called cost per pound, because in my fantasy world, all shippers have a standard cost per pound that they'll ship things for, no matter where I ship them. Don't follow the schema if you're making a real ordering application. Okay, so I have a new class. I do need to change the ordering context here in order to essentially pull it into code first. So I'll add a public method here, dbSet, use the shipper, call this shippers, and add the getter and setter. Okay, and I'll save my work. So I'll run the application again. It'll go out, see that the model has changed, and make that change to add that table. It would also potentially change other tables if I had any navigation properties, it might create a many-to-many relationship or many-to-many table if I needed that. Notice that my data is still intact. I'll come back over to Management Studio and Object Explorer, refresh the tables, and you can see that I now have a shippers table as I defined it within Code First. So it made that migration and kept my data intact. Okay, one other thing I want to point out is that I haven't really talked about this migration history. This is a table that is added to any table, any database that you create using Code First. It's used by all of the initializers, the drop create initializers as well as migrations. Now, you may see sample code or tutorials or things like that out on the web that indicates that this __ migration history table is part of system tables. That's how it was initially when Code First migrations came out. So back in the Entity Framework 5 timetable or thereabouts. But they changed that in Entity Framework 6. Okay, so just be aware of that. It's not in system tables anymore. It's here. So if you drill down into this, you can see the schema. It's pretty simple, just a few columns, a migration ID, context key, a model, and a product version. And if I look at the data there, it's just a regular table in the database, so I can manipulate it however I want. You can see that I have the initial create, and it has a hash, essentially, of the model that it uses to compare the current state of the model to some other state. The current state of the model in my application to the latest state within the database. And as you can see, I've had 3 automatic migrations, and this is where it stores that information rather than within the project. And as you can see, it also maintains this product version in order to keep track of all this. Okay, now I just point that out as a matter of interest. It's not something you have to pay any attention to whatsoever. Automatic migrations takes care of that for you. It really is a marvelous solution. It was pretty nice that Microsoft came out with essentially a limited form of Code First initially, so it could learn really how to make it work, and then came out with migrations and it could build on that experience. So it really was worth waiting for.